Hello, hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. How are you guys doing today? Can you guys hear me? If you can hear me, unmute your mics. Welcome. We'll give everyone a couple of seconds to join. You guys can unmute your mics and go ahead and say hello to everyone.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Happy Tuesday. I swear, in between Christmas and New Year's, I never know what day it is. Like all day today, I was like, hey, Wednesday? Is today Sunday? It's been one of those weeks. But how's everybody doing?
I'm fine here in Trinidad and Tobago.
Nice. And Aisha, where are you?
I'm here in Florida, just trying to enjoy the break.
Nice. Jungle Flower, are you up north?
I'm in Toronto.
Yes. And KL, where are you?
And I'm in the British Virgin Islands.
Ah, very nice. Everyone is scattered all over the place. So I see that we have some people joining us right now. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, welcome. This is going to be a very informative discussion. I just want to say thank you to my Zurena. This segment is actually powered by them. We are very appreciative to have you guys on board for this. My name is Kerra Denel, and I am the founder of Caribbean Women's Power Lunch Incorporated, as well as Kerra Denel Entertainment Incorporated, and I am the founder of Kerra Loves Kids. I wanted to use my platform as a voice for the community, so I've put together this panel of amazing experts to discuss domestic violence and breaking the silence. So everyone, get something in hand to have a drink and just sit back and, get that notepad out and be ready to learn a lot today. So I would like to start off the discussion with Jungle Flower. She is a warrior poet and founder of Reclaim Your Voice. Welcome, Jungle Flower.
Hi. Thank you so much, Kerra, for having me.
You're so welcome. We're honored to have you here today.
Thank you. I've written down my thoughts for today as I am on a bit of a break, and so my throat chakra has been a little bit closed lately. But because of the importance of this topic, I definitely very gladly made an exception to come out of my introversion cave and be a part of this event. So thank you again, Kerra, for putting this together. I'll be reading today just so I can make sure I remember everything that I want to say. So once again, my name is Jungle Flower. My pronouns are she and her. I am someone who has lived experience with psychological abuse, sexual violence, and physical abuse, which I experienced at the hands of a boyfriend when I was 18 years old. I escaped around the 3-year mark when he got arrested for something unrelated, just as things were getting critically dangerous for me. And then in 2012, I founded a grassroots organization called Reclaim Your Voice. We host free monthly events where people who have experienced various forms of abuse and sexual violence can share their stories. The past 14 years of my life since escaping the abuse have made for an incredible journey, and despite how challenging life has gotten at times, not only would I not change a thing, but I have a lot of gratitude for what I have experienced. I know that for some folks who might currently be in a place of pain from the trauma, the idea of feeling grateful for these experiences might seem impossible. So I'd like to share a few of the things that have helped me arrive at this place. I've broken them down into 5 C's, and the first C is community, which can also be called connection. Founding Reclaim Your Voice and bringing people together monthly was not a natural thing for me, but it was an intuitive thing. I tend to be very introverted, and in the past, I wasn't the type to willingly get involved in community. I liked to stay behind the scenes, and I kept to myself. I also had no formal training whatsoever in trauma or healing work, but I felt called to do this, and I'm so glad I listened to that call, because being around other people who've had similar experiences has helped me feel so much less alone. Listening to all these stories of trauma and healing over the years has helped me learn a lot about how I can heal my own life. And when the road gets rough, as it tends to do sometimes when we are committed to our healing and growth, I get a lot of strength from knowing that there is a whole community of people who are morally supporting me. There is a saying I've heard doing this work that goes, you were abused in isolation, you can only heal in a community. And that has definitely been the case with me and so many other people that I know. The second C is catalyze. It is said that pain is the greatest catalyst for change, and I can honestly say that the level of pain and grief I experienced in the aftermath of the trauma led to my spiritual awakening. It led me to shift my focus from I to we, from why me to how many other people are going through this right now, which led to me creating a solution, a way of adding healing to the world via Reclaim Your Voice. It enhanced my ability to feel empathy and compassion for others. And in this regular and consistent practice of compassion and empathy, I've become a softer, kinder, and more loving person than I was before the abuse. And so, to share a quote I heard from Eric Thomas, do not allow this to break you, but may this be your breakthrough. The third C is for courage. When I stood up at the front of the room to tell my story at the first Reclaim Your Voice event, I was hit with a paralyzing realization. I still hadn't gotten over my fear of public speaking. It's something that I suffered from my entire life, but because the last time I'd had to speak in a room full of people was in high school, I simply figured that I'd gotten over it as I matured. But in that moment, as I struggled to get my voice and my body to stop shaking, I realized the fear had never actually left me. I fought my way through the speech, and as much of an ordeal as that was, and even though I didn't feel any better or braver afterwards, I continued to push myself to get up on stages because I knew that this cause was bigger than myself. Out of love for myself and others, I pushed through that lifelong fear to help bring attention to the prevalence of abuse. And what's so remarkable about this to me is not only have I now completely conquered that fear, but I also make my living today off of telling my story. Courage for me has been so healing because each time I hit the boundaries of my comfort zone, boundaries that are keeping me small and stagnant, I have to call upon my courage in order to push through. And doing this on a regular basis has helped me navigate the world from a place of confidence. The fourth C is creativity. I once read that people who are abusive see their victims as containers in which to dump their own shame, fear, and trauma. And so many of us who are walking around having been abused are carrying our own trauma. We're carrying the trauma of people who have abused us, and we're carrying our inherited generational trauma. So what do we do with all this energy? Create. Creativity is one of the most powerful ways to process pain. Creativity transmutes this negative energy into something different and something beautiful. Traumatic experiences cause a decrease in function in the verbal center of our brains. And so creative expression helps us to heal by expressing. My chosen form of creative expression, which has helped me heal from trauma, is spoken word poetry, a gift I only discovered a few years ago and one I never would have tapped into had I not had the courage to overcome my stage fright. And the fifth and final C is for compassion. And I'm not pushing anyone to have compassion on the people who have abused them. No matter what anyone says, that is a personal choice, and it is not the only path toward healing. But what is imperative when it comes to healing is self-compassion, forgiving ourselves for what we feel we put ourselves through, or for going back to toxic situations again and again, or for neglecting ourselves or our loved ones. Practicing self-compassion when difficult emotions arise and in the moments when it feels like we're suddenly regressing on our healing journeys. Healing is not linear. It is complex and often unpredictable, but being able to meet ourselves with compassion, no matter how we are feeling and what we are facing, helps us create a loving and safe inner space for ourselves, and that's where a great deal of healing occurs. I do have a poem that I'd like to share, but I'm wondering if maybe I should share it toward the end. Kerra, I will let you decide what you think is best.
I think that we should keep it for the end.
Okay. I think so too.
Yes. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate that. Next up, I will bring KL.
Hello, everyone.
Hi,
Hi,
KL.
Kira. Let me thank you first for the opportunity to
Of course.
I will be addressing the legal perspective. As Kira might have indicated, I am a lawyer by profession and I practice in the criminal arena. So, for the most part, my perspective on tonight's panel discussion will be from a legal perspective. I practice in the British Virgin Islands, as I would have indicated that I currently reside here. And for the last 2 years, I have practiced as a prosecutor for the state. So there are a few things that I would like to touch on very briefly as it pertains to domestic violence from the legal perspective. And I could firstly start off by indicating that I know when we hear the term domestic violence, we usually or we automatically think about the physical aspect of it, the violent aspect of it. But domestic violence.
Yeah, I apologize. Would you mind just fixing your camera? We can't see the top of your head.
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
It is
Sorry
better.
about that. Much better. Thank you.
Yeah, so when we address the whole concept of domestic violence, it actually covers a wide variety of things. And that includes the verbal violence, emotional abuse, even financial and economic abuse. So it actually covers a wide range of variations of abuse. And I am sure that the other panelists will address the various forms of violence later on in our discussion this evening. But I think what is most important from my perspective is the question of what are the options or what are the remedies available to persons who experience domestic violence. And to keep it very simple without going into too many legalities, there are really two options that are readily available. And I always suggest to persons who are in immediate danger, immediate fear, immediate harm, to first utilize the civil aspect of the law. And that simply refers to an option such as a protection order. So where someone is a victim of domestic violence or where someone is in fear that they are about to be subjected to some sort of injury or to some sort of pain, to some sort of hurt, they can apply, and I'm speaking on a Caribbean-wide level, and I'm sure it is the same in the US, for what you call a protection order, which is treated by the courts with urgency. And a protection order simply is an order from a court of law indicating that the abuser should stay away from the victim, should stay away from the applicant, the person who would have applied for the order. That order could also contain other instructions as it pertains to treatment of the person by way of contacting and communicating with them, whether it be by cellular phone or whether it be by any other means of communication. It can also include considerations to cover protection for siblings or children, whatever the case might be. So the order in itself is a very useful tool that victims of domestic violence have available to them in situations where they are in cases of imminent fear or harm or danger to their person or to their children, their spouses, their brothers, sisters, relatives, because it is a far-reaching order. For instances where persons wish to take it a step further, you have what you call criminal complaints. So we've moved away from the civil jurisdiction where you actually go to the police, you make a report, you tell them what has occurred, and criminal complaint can be filed against the person, which would then lead to proceedings. And that's where the terms trial and courtroom and prosecutor and the defense attorney and all of that comes in, because at that point the person will be made responsible and will be held responsible to answer to the allegations or to the reports of domestic violence. The difficulty that I have noticed arising not just in the British Virgin Islands but across the territory, across the region at large, is that there are a lot of times when persons would make complaints, but unfortunately they would not follow through with those complaints. It might be because they have reconciled with the abuser. It might be because they are fearful for their life and that they have been threatened should they continue with the criminal complaints. It might be because they just don't feel safe. It might be because they don't have the support that they need. And I think this is where we need to step in as a society to provide the support to victims of domestic violence, because it is essential when it comes to stages like going to a trial or actually going to the police station and giving a full report. So that's one of the challenges that I've noticed from a legal standpoint that victims of domestic violence encounter. Because for some reason, more often than not, after filing the complaint, I'm not sure if it would have been in the heat of the moment, after going to the police station, after nursing the injuries, some weeks or some months later, you would usually find that victim turning around and either recanting or withdrawing the complaint or expressing their indication or the desire to have the matter dropped. And that in itself becomes a problem, because we are now sending the message to abusers that, I'm sorry, I'm having a little issues here with my camera, Kira. um,
No problem.
this should be fine. Should I turn it?
That works perfect.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm sorry. So I was saying that we don't want to send a message out to abusers that it is okay to you know, abuse, to injure, to hurt, whether it be emotionally, whether it be financially, whether it be physically, and that at the end of the day, you can turn around and get away with it for one reason or the other. There are even circumstances where you'd find that the abusers know for a fact that by the time the matter gets to court, they would turn around and do something, social act of love or appreciation that will get the victim to either change their mind or to be convinced that the abuser has changed or is willing to seek counseling and will not do it again, and for a very number of reasons. But at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is to have the matter come to an end before proper ventilation and holding that abuser responsible. So that's one of the challenges that we face. As it pertains to the issue of what I know a lot of persons consider revenge porn, it's something that I was asked to also touch on. And it simply means that the abuser, for whatever reason, would release different footages, whether it be videos or pictures of the victim in an effort to either embarrass, degrade, or manipulate them. In the varying jurisdictions, there is actually law that protects a victim in these situations. And as I indicated, I practice in the BVI, so I can speak directly to the BVI. There is actually cybercrime legislation that protects a victim, that protects a complainant in instances where persons release these kind of degrading footages without the consent of the complainant. The difficulty is that a lot of times we are not properly aware or informed of what our rights are, and as a result, we allow persons to get away with murder, for the lack of a better term. So what we also need to do as citizens, I'm not asking, that we go into law school or go sit in a library and read through all of the laws and the legislation that is relevant to your particular jurisdiction or your particular country. But there are certain very basic minimum things that we ought to know that we can arm ourselves with. And when we see it happening to our colleagues or to our friends or to our family and relatives, we can be in a position to advise, in a position to encourage, in a position to point out certain things to them which could help in the situation that they may find themselves. So what I would ask is that in addition to standing up and raising our voices, in addition to breaking the silence of domestic violence, it is also important that we educate ourselves on the different laws that are available for our protection, whether it be persons releasing particular videos of you in an effort to manipulate you or embarrass you, whether it be in relation to the protection orders that I would have spoken about earlier in terms of what can be done, how can you apply for it, who can assist you, what is the procedures that you have to go through, where do you have to file the application, the bare minimum. It is important that I think, Kira, electricity just went off in my area. So I'm going
Oh
to try
no, we
to
can
wrap
still hear
up.
you though.
I'm going to try to wrap up shortly. So what I would also encourage is that we stay the course. So if there is anything you take away from what I've shared tonight before my electricity company decided it was time to stop, is that we speak up. Speak up in that we do not have to suffer in silence. And I say we because it applies to both men and women. Too many times we always believe or we assume that domestic violence relates more so to women. But I have seen several situations where men have been victims of domestic violence. In addition to speaking up, we should stand up, because it is all well and good to have different forums and different rallies and different opportunities to break the silence. But if we don't take a stand, and I mean take a stand as a victim, take a stand as a supporter of a victim, a family of a victim, relative of a victim, then this whole attempt becomes futile. So we should speak up, we should stand up, and from a legal perspective, we should show up. Because a lot of times, like I would have indicated, we make a complaint, we run to the police, we end up at the hospital. At that, thank God for generators. At that opportunity, we are ready to run with the charge. We are ready to pursue charges because the injury is fresh, the hurt is fresh. At that point, we've made the resolution that we're not taking it anymore. And then a few weeks pass, a few months pass, we don't show up, police can't find us, social workers can no longer reach us on our cell phones, we're not responding to messages because we've lost the interest or we've decided for whatever reason that we are not going to show up. So speak up, stand up, show up, and as I would have indicated, learn up as best as we can. Let's try to find material that is informative. Let's try to find material that educates us on our very basic rights as citizens, as human beings, because it will come in very handy. Because we never know when we might be the ones dealing with either friends or loved ones, or probably in the unfortunate position ourselves of being victims of domestic violence. So that would be my takeaway from a legal standpoint today, that we not only speak up, we not only show up, we not only stand up, but we also learn up to the best of our abilities. Kira, I think that in my time, before something else happens, I'm going to pass on to the other panelists.
Thank you so much for expanding on the legal aspects of domestic violence. I know that was very helpful. I think his connection, oh, we're back on. Yes, thank you so much for sharing with us. Next up, we have Mr. Hanif A. Benjamin, who is a clinical therapist and traumatologist. He will be sharing with us today.
Hi, good night, Kira, and all your followers and viewers throughout the world. A very nice composition of panelists from all over the globe, as we can see. So I'm very excited about the discourse thus far, one from a very personal perspective and one from a legal perspective. And what is very interesting about the two component, it ties in very nicely with what I want to talk about tonight, And tonight I want to touch on two things in particular. I want to speak to system perspective, and I want to speak to trauma, because I've been in so many forums in relation to domestic violence or intimate partner violence, as it were. And one of the things that I've often postulated is that we need to get away from the 180-degree kind of conversation and concentrate more on a 360 approach. And the reason why I see a 360 approach is because if we are to get ahead of this domestic violence or intimate partner situation, not just in the Caribbean, but whatever, we need to take a different look and see what are we not doing. I think there are certain things that we are doing and we are doing well. However, the question that I often ask is, what are we not doing? What are we not taking into account in order to get this thing under control? Because I consider this to be a crisis in our Caribbean. I mean, and I'm speaking from the Caribbean perspective. I consider this to be a crisis. I consider this to be a serious situation, not only affecting a victim, because I have seen a victim to be more than a man who has been beaten or a woman who has been beaten. A victim, in my view, move on to the child or children, to the family members, to the community. And when I say community, the church, the school, your workplace, I see a victim in all of them. And so the question is, how are we protecting all the victims? Because from one domestic violence act, one domestic violence situation, there are multiple victims, you see? And so let me start by looking at the system in this 360 approach that I'm speaking about, because it is very easy for one to say, get help. It is very easy for one to say, you will be okay. It is very easy for one to say, take out a restraining order, albeit excellent things that must be done. But in taking out a restraining order, one must consider, am I protected enough when I take out this order? Am I protected enough if I were to step forward and go to the police? We have situations where victim refused to go to the police station. And I think the speaker before me, he also spoke about it, where some people, even in the middle of an investigation, decide to no longer cooperate. And one must ask ourselves the question, why is that? Why are our victims not willing to go the length? And so we must examine the system that surrounds this victim and whether the system is helping or hurting the victim. And when I say whether the system is helping or hurting, are there adequate places that a victim can disappear? Are there adequate public system where a person can get help, mental health? Do we have systems in place where a victim can feel comfortable to go to law enforcement and be okay that, you know what, something will be done? We still have a situation in Trinidad and Tobago and in other Caribbean islands where the police seldom get involved because they believe that this is a personal issue. And because it is a personal issue, they don't want to get involved. And they get involved when a crime is committed. And I'm speaking from experience as recent as 2 weeks ago, when one of my clients told me she went to the police station and they told her, listen, the man do nothing yet. So what you want us to do? And so this lady is living in fear because the man ain't do nothing yet, or let me put it in proper terms, the man have not committed a crime as yet. However, the law in Trinidad and Tobago was just changed, the Domestic Act, to represent in a more prominent way psychological and emotional abuse. Now, the question that has arisen is, how do you prove psychological and emotional abuse? And so we are now grappling with that nuance in the law. And so when we're talking about how do we help a victim, we have to consider whether the system is available to this victim. And when I say the system, the legislation. Where are we with legislation? How up to date are we with legislation? I'm talking about the police. How well trained are our police? How involved are our police? I commend the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service because they just, recently launched the domestic violence unit, right? I'm talking about the court system. Do we have specialized court that deals specifically with domestic violence cases? Again, the lawyer before spoke about the swiftness of which some of these decisions has to be taken, especially if you want to get a protection order. Do we have specialized, or is it time for us to develop specialized court that only deal with domestic violence situation, that provides psychological and clinical and trauma counseling, that have mediation as part of the system there, has some form of expediency within that system, or is it lump in all of the judiciary and all of the legal system that is surrounding the court? And so we need to look at that. We also need to look at family or that type of intimate support system. Is it that that support system is available? Are there grants and other type of things that if a person needs to move and move quickly, they can be aided? Those are some of the systemic things that we must consider when we are treating with domestic violence and or intimate partner violence. Because if those things are not in place, what you have is a victim who will remain a victim because they believe if they step out to protect themselves in some form or fashion, the system will not be able to protect them the way they ought to be protected. And therefore, they remain a victim because it is easier to stay in the drama that they know than to step out and to welcome a new level of drama that they may not know, which may be even more violent. And so the question now leads me to the system of trauma. As a traumatologist, I'm treating people who are in domestic violence situation. It is very difficult. It is very difficult because how do you tell a client, right, who is living in the situation that they are going to be okay at some point? How do we work through this? And so I always remember Dr. Nadine Burke, who in one of her public appearances gave the analogy of a bear, and I want to give it here. When you are being chased by a bear in the forest, there are certain things that happen to your body. Your heart begins to pump, you begin to sweat, you're frightened, the cortisol keep moving, the amygdala jumps in, and the bear runs away or you outrun the bear. And so your body becomes now back to homeostasis, or it becomes calm again. But in this situation, when you are living with the bear every single day, morning, noon, and night, what do you do? How do you survive? Especially if the systems are not in place for a hasty retreat. And so we have to consider serious level of trauma work with people who are living in a domestic violence situation. And might I add, in most cases, victims who are coming to me for therapy, they come to me in silence. They most time lie about where they are going in order to come for therapy. Because if the abuser knows that they are seeking help, it will not be allowed. And so we see a continuation and a perpetuation of this trauma in a traumatic situation over and over and over and over. And so I say to a lot of my clients, you have to begin to do things within your own sphere that can help you to treat with some of the issues that you may be going through. And I was very impressed with Ms. Flower, I think, in the first Jungle Flower. Yes, Jungle Flower. And I think she gave some perfect recommendation in terms of treating with your own recovery. Because chances are you may not be able to come to me for therapeutic intervention. Chances are you may not be able to leave, but you need to survive. And so you need to become one with your mind. You need to become one with your body. You need to understand your inner workings. You need to understand the power of the bear and how you react to that bear and how that bear reacts to you. And so sometimes when I say to clients and people tell me, Hanif, you crazy for saying that? I said, you need to understand what is your dynamics in the home. Because I am a realist and not everybody can escape. And not everybody is able to escape. And not everybody may want to escape. So you have to begin to protect yourself right where you are in the home by using those mechanisms that can save you. And I think by starting in the mind, by starting in the body is the best place to begin the conversation with you. And so it is important, it is very important for you to understand in the first instance whether the system that surrounds you can in fact protect you. And also you need to understand your place in this proverbial forest and how can you protect yourself in this forest knowing that this bear is with you every single day. And so it is important for you to begin to sort out in your own quiet moments your sense of mindfulness, your ability to be able to treat with the difficulty that you face, however, also becoming one with your own mind. Those are critical areas that you must consider. At this point, I will pause and I will take comments and questions at the end. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Hanif. That was very, 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 very insightful. I'm just looking at the comments here, and we do have a few questions, which we will take at the end. We'll have a question and answer period after Miss Aisha T. McDonald, who I will bring up next. Hi, Aisha. So Aisha is a licensed mental health counselor and certified trauma expert, and she will be sharing some nuggets with us today as well.
So thank you so much for having me. I have to say that I am so grateful that we're creating this space and creating this conversation, because one of the things that we don't do in the Caribbean community is really talk openly about these things. And when people do come out and are open and willing to talk about things, maybe from their own personal perspective, one of the first things you hear is the negators and the negativity. And, you know, the impact of them speaking out is usually met with so much criticism. And so it's important for us to recognize how important this conversation is, because the mindset of a lot of us is that this is man and woman business, you know, is them private things, and we keep it behind closed doors. But this is happening so rampantly in our community, and if we don't make the space for it, it's never really going to be properly addressed. I've worked in the field for a number of years, and I live in South Florida that has a very prominent Caribbean community, as well as being from the Caribbean. I grew up in the islands myself, and I can tell you very clearly that somebody you know is probably being abused right now. And I'll repeat that. Somebody you know, somebody you are close to is probably being abused right now, and you probably don't know. And you probably think to yourself that, no, they would tell me. None of my friends have gone through this. Nobody I know has ever been affected. But the United Nations put out some statistics recently that said through studies and just really they looked at a lot of the developed countries within the Caribbean. And from that, they were able to estimate that 1 in 3 Caribbean women will be a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their lifetime. That's 1 in 3. And that's based on statistics of people who have sought help, people who have made reports to law enforcement, people who have gone through the court system, people who have come out and openly reported that they were going through this. But we know for a fact that this is not something that everybody who's a victim or a survivor talks about. And so that 1 in 3 number isn't even the realistic number. And also that 1 in 3 number really focused on the violence towards women. But domestic violence knows no gender. Men are also affected. Children are affected. One of the panelists really spoke about how it impacts every single person in that household, as well as every person in that family. And one of the issues that we have is because we are from a very patriarchal type of community in the Caribbean, we don't necessarily hear a lot of the men who speak out about what they've experienced as well, because there is a sense of pride in admitting that you have been victimized in such a way. So let me start out with saying domestic violence is not just physical. We focus on that a lot because, especially through the criminal courts, the physical aspect and the sexual aspect are very criminalized than the ones that we can really pursue, because usually there's proof, right? If somebody hits me, I can show you where my bruises are, or I can show you the wounds that I've gotten from that. But domestic violence is physical abuse. It is also the sexual abuse that individuals endure. It is psychological and mental and emotional abuse that individuals go through. And sometimes they may never be physically hit, but the psychological harm of being in these type of relationship are so much more long lasting and impactful in so many different ways, because the physical wounds can heal, but the psychological trauma that individuals carry with them after being in these type of situation is long lasting. And there's also financial abuse. And financial abuse can be 2 ways. Financial abuse can be using a person for their money, running up their credit cards, taking their income and using it for your own purposes, even when the person doesn't necessarily want to share or is willing to share, but more so against their will. Or financial abuse can be another way. It can be because I'm the one with the money, I'm the one in control. I'm the one who pays the bills. I'm the one who buys you this. And so if I buy your clothes, I tell you what to wear. Because at the end of the day, intimate partner violence, domestic violence is really all about power and control. It's about one person having that power and having that control over another human being without that person's consent, and using methods and ways to try to make sure that that person stays in that relationship and that person stays in a position of where they can continue to control them. I hear a lot of the times we talk about the victims in terms of, well, why do you stay? What did you do? Why would he say that to you? Why would she do this to you? And we really focus when we talk about domestic violence in more of a reactive way and say, well, what happened? The first thing you hear when somebody comes out in the public and really talks about their experience is, well, you must have done something for him to do that, because why would anybody do that? Especially when we're familiar with the perpetrators, because we tend to think there must have been a reason, a cause for this person to act in this way. Very rarely do we ever ask, why did this perpetrator perpetrate? If somebody gets their house robbed and their house has been burglarized and the police officers come there to deal with this burglary, right? They don't go, well, maybe you were just asking for it. I mean, look at all these big TVs that you said you had in your house. If you hadn't bought the big TVs, then they wouldn't want to rob you. We tend to be more sympathetic to people who have been victims of other crimes. If somebody meets in a car accident and we come, the person who is at fault is the one who the police then interviews and interrogates. If somebody gets robbed, then we're very sympathetic to the victims of this burglary. We're very understanding. Yet somehow, with intimate partner violence and domestic violence, a lot of our interrogation and hard questions go to the victims in those situations and not the perpetrator. Why did you choose to do that? Why did you hit this person? What makes you feel that you have the right to have this type of control over another human being? And we're not asking those questions. And what happens because we're not asking those questions, and because we're doing a lot of victim blaming in our communities, is that we stigmatize the victims of these types of situations, and we make it harder for them and sometimes unsafe for them to really come forward and really speak their truth and talk about their experiences, because they're so fearful of being judged. They're so fearful of being criticized. They're so fearful of how people are going to react to finding out that they allowed themselves to be abused, because that's the way we kind of deal with them. How could you allow somebody? I would never do this. Nobody would ever be able to do this to me. So how could you allow this to happen to you, instead of really pointing the finger at the person who is abusive? Because at the end of the day, people choose to be abusive. They do. Um, when you think about a lot of the individuals who have been accused of being abusive personalities, really and truly, a lot of people's defense of them is, well, I know that person and they've never been like that towards me. Well, of course not. You're not their victim. A bully knows exactly who they're going to bully. Think back to when we were in prep and primary school and the bullies used to run the playground during lunchtime, right? If a bully walks up to one kid and says, yo, give me a lunch, and that kid refuses, then the bully knows that that's possibly not going to be the best bet for me to go back to the next day and try to get the lunch for. And so they're not going to show their bullying ways to every single person they come in contact with. But once they've identified the person that they can victimize, then they target in on that person, and that person becomes vulnerable to their bullying tactics. And so everybody else may see the best side of them. They may see the affable person who is so funny and so nice and sometimes so very charming, because that charm is one of the ways that they manage to convince people to get into relationships with them. An abusive person is never just abusive off the bat. You don't go out on your first date and you're at the movie theater and you say, well, hey, what movie you want to watch? Because I want to watch this. And they say, no, I think I want to watch the latest comedy instead. And you're like, no, I was really looking for the superhero. And they don't slap you in the face right then and there to try to convince you to continue dating them. No, there's something that's called a honeymoon phase. And the honeymoon phase is when that person is oftentimes the best relationship that individuals have ever been in. They're kind, they're sweet, they do all the right things. They treat that person like they are treasured. And you get so deep into it and so enmeshed in these types of relationship that by the time the abuse starts, whether it takes weeks, whether it takes months, sometimes the abuse doesn't start for years. That person is now emotionally attached to someone in this situation who now is going to try to enforce tactics of power and control to keep them in the relationship. And so a lot of the times when we hear about victims coming forward and saying, hey, this happened to me, the question shouldn't be, well, what did you do? Or why did you stay? The question really should be towards the perpetrator and asking, why did you do that to them? Because if we don't start changing our language surrounding domestic violence, if we continue to victim blame, if we continue to criticize individuals for being abused, then we're never really going to break this cycle. Because I can ask these victims day in, day out, why? But unless we are addressing the perpetrators of these types of abusive incidences, this will going to be a continuation. And a lot of the times in our society, unfortunately, we know people who make statements that we know are not good statements. We have friends who we've heard say and talk a certain type of way to somebody that makes you go, that didn't sound too right. But a lot of the times we're not addressing it when it comes up. We're not asking these individuals, that's not so right, I'm not sure, say I saw you for talk to people. We don't say that. We kind of laugh it off, especially in situations that make us feel uncomfortable, make us feel awkward, or we just blame it on, well, that's always, that's just how we are. And we use that a lot. This is just a part of our culture. This happens to everybody. That's what relationships are like. And that enables the violence to continue and continue and continue. Because I promise you, abusers are not people who are out of control. They aren't. If they had anger management problems and they were just out of control and unable to stop themselves, then they would abuse every single person that they came in contact with. If an abusive person is at work and their boss says something to them that they don't like, they would lash out at the boss. They would lose themselves in that moment because they're unable to control their anger. But in fact and in truth, these are individuals who are very much in control. They know exactly who to victimize. They know exactly when to do it. And most of the time, they know how to do it. They know where to hit people on the body that will make sure that they're not leaving bruises, that to make sure that they have excuses that they can come up with for how that happened and why it happened. Sometimes they are brainwashing the victims themselves and using statements such as, I wouldn't do this if you hadn't made me upset. If you had just said this instead of this. I'm not really like this. It only happens when I'm drunk. I not only in my career have I worked with victims, but I've also worked with individuals in the court system and in the jails who have been perpetrators of violence. And I promise you, sometimes listening to the things that they have told me, it oftentimes feels as if they all go to the same class and they're all tutored the same way because they have such similar statements that they make over and over and over again until their victims start to believe it. And one of their main tactics is to isolate victims from friends and family. And so when victims do realize how deep and entrenched they are in these types of abusive situations, they have become so cut off from friends and family that they oftentimes don't have any support. They don't have anyone to call. They don't have anybody who will believe them. And unfortunately, at the time when someone chooses to leave an abusive situation, their risk of harm becomes even more increased. And that's when their life can actually be in physical danger because nobody likes to lose control, especially an abuser. And if they realize that they're going to lose that power and control over their victim, that's when their behavior tends to escalate. And so if we're not addressing the stigma of domestic violence, if we're not addressing the victim blaming and the critiques that we give when faced with these situations, we are never really going to ever really make a headway. They can change all the laws that they want, but unless we're giving individuals societal support instead of treating them with shame when they come out, then we aren't really going to make any great strides because our culture has become so accepting of a type of behavior as if it's the norm and it's just what happens in relationships. And maybe you shouldn't have said that, because if you had said that, then this wouldn't happen to you. Or maybe you shouldn't have done this. And I promise you this, there is absolutely nothing that somebody can do that should ever warrant somebody putting their hands and physically hurting them, especially when it's somebody you love. Love is not abuse. Love is not hurt. Love is not shame. Love is not public embarrassment. That's not what love is supposed to be. And it's very hard for me to compute how we can justify abusive situations with, well, if the person hadn't done this, then this wouldn't have happened to them. Because how fair is that? And when I say that statistic says it's 1 in 3 individuals who will experience domestic violence in their lifetime, that means think of 3 of your friends. That means one of them may be experiencing domestic violence, but how able are they to really come out and to talk to you and express to you what has been happening in their life if they are fearful of the societal pressures that they will be met with? Because that is real and that is true. And unfortunately, we are not promoting more comfortable situations for people to be able to really address the harm that they have been dealing with and the long-term trauma and impact on their lives. And so that's important for us to really just break it down and realize that instead of always blaming the victim, we need to put the blame where it lies, on the perpetrators of violence, on the individuals who are abusive in the first place. And as more celebrities and public figures come out and really talk about what they have experienced and what they have been going through, it gives me faith and hope that there are individuals who are going through their own personal private situations who will then feel as if they can come out, but they're not going to be able to do that, like Hanif says, unless they have the support of their community. So thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. You definitely hit the nail on the head with everything that you said. We have a ton of questions in here. So what I will do is I will post the questions on the screen, and everyone can feel free to chime in on them. So we have, how can one self-diagnose abuse? Any good use cases of programs that enable, especially the non-obvious types you described, example, financial. Without knowing there's a problem, nothing there will be done. So Aisha, if you want, you can chime in on that first, and then whoever else wants to chime in, you're more than welcome to do so.
So for me, making self-diagnoses of abuse really comes to how much autonomy do I have in my relationship? How much do I have the ability to be my true self, to live my peace, and to be who I want to be? And how much consent am I giving to the decisions that are being made in my relationship? Because that's where the power and control comes in. The power and control comes in when, if my partner and I have decided that I shall take care of the bills and I shall take care of the finances, and so he shares his paycheck with me, and then I distribute that meaningfully, then okay, that's a decision that we have come to ourselves. But if it is a matter of I work and this person says, cash your paycheck and give it to me because you have to, and I'm not being allowed any autonomy over my own money that I work, then that's where that becomes an issue. There's a fine line between an unhealthy relationship and an abusive relationship. You can have an unhealthy relationship where both people are mutually combative. Both of them are emotionally abusive to each other, and both of them are cussing and yelling and in the streets telling their business all day long. But when it becomes intimate partner violence and domestic violence, is when one person manages to have the control the majority of the time, and the other person is more or less reacting to that and not able to enact any control over themselves. And I've known individuals, I used to give presentations and workshops on domestic violence, and I've had individuals who were married for 10, 20 years who came up to me afterwards and were like, I think this might be abuse. Do you think this is abuse? What do you think? Because sometimes when you're so deep in it, it's hard to really tell because it has become your norm. And that's unfortunate, because when it becomes your norm and when all the other relationships around you, this is normalized in those relationships as well, it's really hard to tell that this is abusive. And sometimes it's hard to tell people that what they're experiencing is abusive. There are some really, really good websites out there on domestic violence that everyone can research and really gain information. There are agencies that people can get help at, that can really just give guidance and give a lot of advice. But one of the most important things is to know, how much autonomy do I have over my own life? How much consent am I giving to the situations in my relationship? And also a big, big indicator is, how much do I have the ability to continue living and enjoying the things I like to do and enjoy, or how isolated or cut off have I become from those things because one person wants to maintain control over me?
Thank you. Does anyone want to say something with regards to this? I'm not seeing any movement. Okay.
I can add to that. I think Aisha really covered a lot of probably the most important stuff. Thank you so much, Aisha, for everything that you've said this evening. I think just one small thing I can add, but it still relates to what she shared, is checking in to see, am I living in fear of this person? I think that's a really important and big indicator of whether or not a relationship is abusive.
Okay, great. And the next question is, in what ways can you be helpful to someone who is being abused that will leave briefly and go back to their abuser? Do any of the men want to touch on this?
In respect, I think this is a powerful question, and I think this is something that we deal with more frequent than any other situation in a domestic violence situation. And to some extent, not giving a pass on excuse to the police. In more instances than not, the police may not get involved at a certain point because of this situation. But this situation is quite real and it's quite deep, because it's not just I'm going back to the abuser, but why am I going back to the abuser? Why do I feel the need to? And I think based on the conversation this evening, we can see where it's really about fear in most instances. I also believe that when a person, an abuser, take charge, they literally isolate you, as Aisha said earlier, from all the people you love, all the things you know. And therefore, you have very little to turn to. And in some instances, people are victimized more when they leave, even life-threatening, when they leave or try to leave an abusive situation. So my advice to people who are trying to get away from this, you know what? We are here and available for you. I think we can tell them when you feel you can, because I have often recognized not everybody wants help, not everyone can get the help that they need, and not everybody is able to take the help right now. And therefore, you have to be patient always. You have to be able to say, you know what? This door is always open for you. We must never get fed up and say, I don't want to get part of this again because look, I helped you last week and this week you're going back. No, no, no. Whenever you are ready, whenever you are able to, there's a bag packed here with some important stuff for you, and I am always willing to help. And I think, to me, that is the greatest advice I can give somebody. And I also want to say, especially to women, please, if you have an opportunity to leave, leave. Most time you stay and you tell me, well, it was because of the children. You are harming the children more than you think. The situation is harming the children more than you think. So please don't stay because of the children. Think about your daughter is now going to think that this is normal, and your son might think that this is what he must now do. So don't stay for the children. If you have an opportunity to leave, leave.
Oh, I think you're muted, Kerra.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Hannah. Does anyone else want to speak on that?
I can briefly touch on it again. Just wanted to go back once more to what Aisha said about autonomy, and what Hannah just said also. It's so important that people make the decision on their own to leave an abusive situation, because exercising that autonomy is so important in terms of them reclaiming their power. And so just showing that patience and not abandoning them, being that safe space if they ever choose to leave is so important. And understanding the effects of trauma bonding and how trauma can cause us to crave and miss very extreme situations, but also knowing that in time and with conscious and deliberate choices, that desire and that craving for extreme and sometimes dangerous situations will fade.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from Natasha. Can someone who has been a victim of domestic violence in the past truly get over it without therapy?
So I'm not sure who that question is for, but I would love to address that
So
one.
these questions are open to everyone. So you guys can all chime in on this if need be.
So I definitely am the type of person who, I mean, I'm a therapist. So the first thing I'm always going to do is promote therapy. But I am also understanding of the fact that our Caribbean community um, doesn't always subscribe to the idea of therapy. That is, we don't believe in mental health treatments as much as American culture does. And that is something that I address in my other life, and something I've been doing a lot of work towards, is that the Black and Caribbean community needs to understand that therapy helps. Therapy is here for you. There's a reason why we train to do this. But there's individuals who may not want to go to therapy, and that's okay. That's fine. But how are you addressing the situations that you have gone through? What are your coping mechanisms? Are they healthy coping mechanisms? And how are you getting past the trauma? Because I promise you this, the trauma will follow you. The trauma will continue. And the trauma is not necessarily as simple as, oh, but I'm not around the person anymore, so how can I be traumatized? But after being in these type of relationships, I call it Stockholm Syndrome in a lot of ways. People develop a Stockholm Syndrome in that after being in an abusive relationship, they really do start believing that I deserved it, it was my fault, or I am the reason. And those are really, really hard inner voices to get past. And so what are you doing to make sure that those inner voices don't continue to traumatize you long after the relationship has ended? Because it is important to realize that the impact of these situations is very, very long lasting. And so what are your methods of healing? Because your method of healing may not be therapy, but what other methods of healing are you going to use to make sure that you're living a healthy and productive life, and you are not crippled, in a sense, by what has happened to you in the past? You are not wary of everybody. You are not shattered emotionally because this situation has happened to you. And so there are different methods of healings and different things that individuals do. Some people connect spiritually because that's their biggest connection. Some people have the connection and support of a community and social supports of friends and family who can really be there for them. And some people use other things that are going to result in healthy outcome. So can somebody get past it? Definitely can, you can get past it, but it depends on what you're doing and whether or not are you really healing through your trauma, or are you just suppressing the trauma and it's coming out in other parts of your life.
You know, I wanted to jump in there and I wanted to bring up that same point that you ended with, because I think that is where the major challenge lies. You see, for me, and I tell people, I am not really interested in the black eye or the broken rib, and people tell me I'm cruel for that. And the reason I'm not really interested in that is because that will heal. Your eye will get normal in most cases, yes, and your broken rib will heal again. But it's the mental and the psychological trauma that may live a lifetime. And the point that you brought up there, the last point is most times the sticking point for many persons, because getting over the psychological scar of that abuse is sometimes lifelong. And in most cases, it is suppressed or repressed, it is pushed to the back of the brain, thinking that I dealt with it. But in actuality, what you have done is simply move it aside. However, trauma is such a thing that it is very, very pervasive. It happens whether you want it to or not. So it will manifest in other areas. And so you have to be very guarded for those areas. So if you don't treat with it, whether professionally or not, it will come out at some point, whether it is other relationships, whether it is no or relationship or the lack of, whether it is going back into other abusive relationship because of that Stockholm type of syndrome. You have to be guarded. And that is why I always talk about mindfulness and becoming one with self. Because if you truly understand your mental telepathy, if you understand what you have been through and what you go through on a daily basis from a mental perspective, then you can start to do things to treat with such things, not push it to the back, but treat with it. And I want to suggest mindfulness as one of the first areas to reconnect with yourself. Because what the abuser did is disconnect you from you, to believe that he, or the abuser rather, is in control over you and they have the power. And so getting that autonomy back in your brain, just like Flower spoke about, but getting that autonomy back is going to be critical. And I think beginning from your mind is the first place I would advise somebody to start the journey. You're muted again.
Sorry about that. So we will take 2 more questions. The next question is from Natalie. What is the best way to undo the damage to children after you leave an abusive situation?
I think I can jump in here. The word undo, we could juggle with the word undo, because once you have been traumatized, there is no undoing, because the trauma has occurred already. You cannot unharm me or unrape me or you cannot undo. Rather, you can begin to build a new normal, understanding what occurred, processing the trauma, and begin to build this new normal. Now, the great things with children is that their brain is still at a place where they can be rewired, if you want, because the brain wiring has been probably altered because of the trauma that enters the brain. And so after that, you can begin to rebuild this network, the network within the brain, to help that child to create a new normal. The challenge that I see is when a child may not receive help and grow up with those type of damage, it then creates a new normal, which is an unhealthy normal, you see? And so what can be done there is the aftermath of the abuse, you want to engage that child in healthy therapeutic intervention that is going to help that child to rebuild, in some respects, some of those damaged areas as that child would have been experiencing the trauma. Now, if that child is not exposed to professional therapeutic intervention, you may want to create a new type of childhood that is one that is not marred with pain and hurt, because the child is already synonymous with pain and hurt. And so you want to move away from that type of environment so that the child can develop a better sense of coping, a better sense of resiliency, a better sense of childhood. And children are easy to do that. And so if we give a child a different environment, a different circumstance, a different situation, they will be all right.
Thank you for sharing that, Hanif. Aisha or Kale, would you like to touch on that? Or Flower?
I did have something. I think it's important, and I remember one of the panelists said earlier that a lot of times in situations you'll hear people who say they stay for the children. I come from a personal situation where they stayed because of the children, me being one of the children. And it is very, very important that you realize that the children will always, always be used in situations like this. Even if the person isn't abusive towards them, they will use those children to enforce those power and control tactics on the victim. And even if the child is not witnessing the actual physical abuse, they're still witnessing every other tactic that is being used. Children are very, very emotionally intelligent. They're able to pick up on little cues that even as adults, we don't think children can see. And so I promise you this, the children are seeing the fear, the children are seeing the anger, the children are seeing all the tactics that are being used. And this is like Hanif said, this is wiring their brain in such a way that is going to make them think that this is how relationships should be. This is normal for relationships. And it results in one or two things. It results in children who grow up not knowing any better, because abuse is a learned behavior, unfortunately. It is a behavior that we see and we realize that is used. And so we grow up and we either become victims ourselves because this is how we expect to be treated in relationships, or we grow up and we become perpetrators because this is how I should treat people in relationships. And it is important that when you are in situations where there are children involved, that you realize that living and remaining in this type of household is what you are telling children to expect from their own relationships in the future. I have numerous friends who have been in abusive situations. That 1 in 3 number, I can think of 3 friends right now who are recently and currently still in these type of situations, some of whom have children. And one of the things that I've heard from them is the fear of, well, what will happen if I leave? How am I going to take care of the child on my own? What am I telling them? I'm breaking their relationship with this other parent. And one of the questions that I ask them all the time is, well, what are you telling your children to expect in their own relationship? Would you be okay with your child being treated like this? Would you be okay with somebody talking to your child this way? Because what you are teaching them is that this is okay, this is normal, this is fine, this is how a relationship should be. And so it's important to just realize how not only traumatizing, like Hanif said, it can be to these children, but how impactful it is that we need to teach them better and healthier relationships to be in, because they won't know unless we teach them.
Thank you so much, Aisha. This last question is very interesting. Just gonna put it on the screen here. How do men being abused deal with shame? So I'd love to hear from, a male perspective as well as a female perspective. Mr. Hanif, KL.
Well, I was giving way to counsel, but I'll jump in. The bar. Number 1, silence. Number 2, further abuse. Number 3. So men who are being abused, they refuse in most instances to even make a report, because in this culture you'll be laughed at, because we grew up in a very machismo type of culture where from a boy you are told you are not to cry because you'll be a sissy, you can't do this or you can't do that. And so we have put boys in a box, we have put men in a box, and we have tied that emotional string and we have buried it from boyhood. And unfortunately, men have not been able to express in the main how they feel about things, more so to express that they are in fact being abused. And so you would find that men who are being abused will probably take that to the very end, without saying anything because of the shame. And if they do say it, of course they are ridiculed in some quarters, most quarters, to be quite honest with you. And so they drop it, they never go forward with it. And so you would find substance abuse becoming relevant here, because now they're trying to deal with their own trauma of the abuse and the fact that there are very limited outlet for the man to come forward and to say, hey, this is happening to me. Not that it's not available like it is available for a female, but rather it is not utilized because of the system, again, that system that surrounds it. And so they remain in silence, or if they do come forward, they don't follow through with it because of the shame that is associated with it. And so this is very interesting as well, because in some instances, the man then become an abuser. So the victim becomes the aggressor in some of these instances. And so you have to now be careful that in the local colloquial language, you don't trip. And when you trip now, is a horse of a different color. And so for those of you who don't understand the colloquial language, you don't want to have a manic episode or an episode where violence becomes even greater. And so to taper off this question, we also, in creating systems, need to treat with this. But the bigger picture here is cultural nuances. We need to change the way we see and interact with culture and the culture of violence. We need to change the way we see and treat with culture in relation to gender roles. We need to change the way we treat with boys and how we culture boys so that their emotion is something that is continuously harnessed and utilized so that they can speak. And this is a serious topic indeed, and one that warrants probably an entire conversation by itself. But that is how I would see it.
Okay, great. I will bring Aisha.
So I know when I began my section earlier, I gave the statistics of 1 in 3 women will be victims of violence in their lifetime. Unfortunately, the United Nations at the time didn't have statistics for men in the Caribbean, and that has to do with exactly what the question is about, because of the shame that a lot of individuals feel. In the United States, the statistic that we have is that 1 in 9 men will be victims of domestic violence in their lifetime. But we also know that that's not a true statistic either, because there's also shame. We are socialized in our Caribbean and in the United States, in the westernized communities, um, and to put men exactly like as Hanif said, in certain boxes. And we give men and we enforce certain expectations on males that individuals don't feel comfortable stepping out of the box. And one of that is the idea of strength and the idea of pride and the idea of male ego, and the very machismo-ness of our culture doesn't enable men to be open with being victims, especially when it comes to being victims of abuse. And one of the issues that we have in terms of resources is that a lot of the resources cater to women, cater to children, but where can the men go to get help? If they are able and willing to come forward and say, if they're not fearful of being laughed at by friends and family members, if they're not fearful that they won't be believed, what happens? Or sometimes the idea is that if a woman hits a man or harms a man, then he can take it because he's physically stronger than her. But we have to be mindful again of the fact that domestic violence is not only physical. Only 50% of domestic violence relationships ever result in physical harm. The other 50% of the time, people are using other methods of power and control over individuals to keep them under their thumb, to keep them in these relationships. Unfortunately for men, a lot of them are financially abused and emotionally abused in their situations. And those aren't necessarily situations that individuals can always show proof that this is happening to them. Or they're met with statements like, oh, so that's how my woman treat me. So what about that? So what wrong with that? That's just the expectation of what someone must endure. And unless we are willing to recognize the ways that our socialization of men are harmful to them, and I'll just be point blank. In our westernized society, or the ways that we have socialized men is not only harmful to them, but it's harmful to the women in their lives as well. Because we have socialized men to fit and certain check marks of what we think masculinity should be. And so men aren't able to really come forth and really be expressive in an emotional capacity a lot of the times in ways that would be healthier in our society. And so how do men deal with being abused when there's so much shame attached? That's why we don't have a real statistic for them. That's why we don't have real numbers. So until we really, and when I say victims of domestic violence, I think automatically our brains just go immediately to women, because that's what we recognize as individuals who are victimized, because they're the majority. But unless we are willing to believe victims, whichever gender the victims will be, then we are never going to be able to really address the issues that come up when domestic violence is really so prevalent in our community. And so it's important for us to really just start believing. When someone says this has happened to them, why would they lie? What are people lying about when they're met with so much criticism when they're open and honest about these situations? So it's important for us to start believing people, start supporting people, start being empathetic towards people, and really, even if, oh, this would never happen to me, you don't know. You really don't. You really don't know what could happen or what happened to lead that person to be in this type of situation that caused them this type of abuse and harm.
Thank you, Aisha. I know that KL also wanted to touch on this.
Yes, I will address it very briefly. I think all of the panelists would have hit the nail directly on the head. It is actually the culture that we continue to perpetuate amongst men that needs to be addressed. And I will not go too deeply into it because Aisha just did a wonderful job on that. But even when you look in the criminal arena, you rarely ever find men being complainants in matters involving domestic abuse. And sometimes you're sitting in court and you have the opportunity to hear both sides of the story. You have the opportunity to hear the female and the male. You pause and you ask yourself the question, but who should really be on trial here? Because a lot of the times the men would sit in silence, they would endure the abuse, whether it be physical or the other forms of abuse that were addressed earlier on tonight, and they would say nothing. And in the one moment when that man cracks, in the one moment when he retaliates, he's charged and he's brought before the court, and you're asking yourself the question, why did he do X? Why did he do Y? He's wrong. But when you really sit and you research the history of the relationship, you would learn that for years, this man has been the subject of abuse and he has said nothing. So as Aisha correctly says, I believe we need to believe men. Even from the law enforcement level, I have seen situations where men would approach law enforcement and they'd be ridiculed, they'd be laughed, they'd be told to brush it off, they'd be told to, oh, just give her an opportunity to cool off, she'll be okay. We need to believe them, we need to be empathetic, we need to be supportive, we need to create the environment that a man can come and make a report or indicate that he has been a victim of domestic violence, and we not treat it as if it is something to be laughed at or something to be, not taken as seriously as we would have taken it if it was a female. So I think all of the panelists touched it very, very accurately in terms of how men cope and perhaps the reasons why they continue to deal with the shame in the way that they do. And until we have not decided as a society to change our approach, to change the culture that we perpetuate amongst men, this situation might remain the same. So I hope that helps from a legal perspective, Kira.
It definitely did. Thank you so much to everyone who has shared today. As we get ready to wind down the discussion, Jungle Flower will be sharing a beautiful poem titled Firefly with us. Let me bring her up here.
Thank you so much. This is a brief poem, my first poem I ever wrote, going back to the topic of creativity. I was asked to write a poem and it just kind of came out of me. So I encourage anyone who is currently healing from trauma to see what happens when you put a pen to paper and try not to judge yourself. So this poem is called Firefly. It is based on my own experiences and the stories that others have shared with me. He lived alone in a dark house, in dead silence at the dead center of a dead-end road. He hadn't left this place in many years, maybe more. In fact, he'd forgotten how to find the door. but he seemed content, rooting through the contents of his unconscious self without a flashlight. Right, light, that was what he needed, so he decided to take hers. He reached out his palm to draw her near, and without any fear she came. But when she got close enough, his other hand closed in, of all the things she never saw coming, the firefly soon found herself sentenced to life in a jar on his shelf, trapped. But she understood that he needed light, so without a fight, she stayed. She played house, raising invisible children, making a home from this delicate prison. And as he looked around the room, now illuminated by her light, he saw that the walls were decorated with paintings of the saddest moments from his life. He was blinded by the sight. The dark still persisted, so she kept giving light, and her shine reached all the ends of the unending night. This brightness was something his eyes weren't used to, so he had to turn away. And with her light now cast upon his back, he saw before his eyes a dark figure, and figured darkly that his shadow was his reflection in the mirror. Believing himself to be the monster who's been haunting his own dreams, he screams, he turns back to her and starts attacking her, and his anger is so spectacular that she believes she has done something wrong. So she absorbs all his blows, and they diminish her glow, because the pain is just too strong. But she is too small to contain all his fury, so he hurries to find something else to destroy. He smashes the windows, punches holes in the walls and the halls that go loudly with the noise of it all. Terrified, the firefly lifts her head to pray. And in doing so, she realizes there is no lid on her jar. In fact, there never was one. And just as the house becomes engulfed in the flames of his rage, she lets herself out and she escapes from the fire. Fly, firefly, you are free. Thank you. Thank you.
That was amazing. Such a beautiful and powerful poem. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And what a way to end this panel discussion. I have to give you another round of applause, Jungle Flower. Thank you so much. I just want to say, I know, we have to snap. I just want to say a special thank you to all of my panelists for shedding light on this topic. My hope is that it has helped someone, or you guys can share the information with someone who needs it. I will be compiling a list of resources after I speak with each panelist after this, and I will send out an email so you guys can go on to cwplglobal.com and subscribe, or kerradenel.com and subscribe. Once a link with this video as well as resources that you guys can use. I also want to say a special thank you to our sponsor, Zurena, and my team for making this possible. I'm not sure if you guys have any parting words before we close out. You're welcome to say it something now. Let me know.
I can.
It's like everyone freezes.
I just want to quickly mention, someone had asked about online resources. So Reclaim Your Voice, we host free events. We'll be resuming in January. We try to do them bi-weekly, and we do them over Zoom, where people share their stories and we do group discussions, or we do a creative exercise or a skills building exercise. So that might be an option for some folks. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, be notified of upcoming events. Our Instagram handle is Reclaim Your Voice.
Awesome. And I will include all of your website information, your Instagrams, and the email. So like I said, for those of you who are watching, make sure you guys subscribe to the mailing list. You can also check us out on Instagram and Facebook. Send us a message, send us a DM, Kerra Denel, or okay? So I guess, yes, so we close out again. Thank you so much. I pray that you all stay safe during these times. And just remember, keep loving, keep smiling, and keep going. Blessings to all of you, and we will see you guys very soon. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.